Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give folks another couple of minutes to log on, and then we will get started. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for attending today. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jackie Garlock, and I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Burnout Prevention Through Compassion Training. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone so that you know how to participate in today's event. So please note that upon joining the webinar, you will be placed on mute. This is just to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation. If you would like to activate closed captions for the presentation, we've made that available. You can do that by clicking the button on your toolbar that says Live Transcript and then selecting Show Subtitles. If you have come across technical issues with this or any other aspects of your Zoom during today's event, please chat to the host who will be able to assist you. You will also have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation. You can do this utilizing the chat box feature. There's a little dialog bubble on the toolbar in the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to open the chat feature. In order to ensure that we're able to answer as many questions as time permits, we're requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and then we're going to address them during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. We'd also appreciate if folks could take a moment to fill out the brief feedback survey that will appear on your screen after you close out the webinar. And please let us know if you have any suggestions for future topics that you'd like us to cover. Also, important to know that the recording and the presentation slides for this presentation will be posted on our website, CTAC New York at ctacny.org within the next 2 to 3 business days. So we are very, very excited today to have with us Dr. Bornali Basu. Dr. Basu is a licensed psychologist on the clinical faculty at the Department of Psychiatry at NYU's Grossman School of Medicine. And she also maintains a private psychotherapy practice in New York that focuses on compassion and mindfulness-based approaches. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us. And I will now pass it along to Dr. Basu to get us started.
Thank you for that introduction, Jackie, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you. In preparation for this webinar, we requested you submit a list of typical stressors and challenges that you face often on a daily basis. I'm going to keep this list of work-related challenges in mind and try my very best to keep our time together relevant and practical. And so with that in mind, this presentation is an introduction to the science of compassion, clarifying how cultivating related skills may protect against burnout and also help those of us working in the caring professions reconnect with meaning and purpose. Discussions about compassion in medicine typically focus on the importance of providing compassionate care to others, but a focus only on patient-directed compassion can be unsustainable. I work primarily with health practitioners in my private practice, nurses, doctors, therapists, and in my experience, the pandemic has only brought into sharper relief certain existing dynamics. A work environment that is objectively challenging and stressful, together with a predisposition many of us in healthcare share to compartmentalize or to even suppress emotion in order to keep going, in order to stay patient-focused. And so if you're interested in protecting yourself against the potential for burnout, if you're starting to notice related signs and symptoms in yourself, your colleagues, your team, please know that you're not alone. According to multiple sources of survey data, including your own responses to the questions we put out, the prevalence of burnout remains a cause for concern. As we move through the presentation, I ask that you draw on your own experiences to reflect and deepen your understanding, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue towards the end of the hour. So here's a plan for our time together. I want to run through quite quickly information about prevalence, intervention, evidence-based interventions, just to give us a foundation on which to start the exploration. I want to then spend more time on compassion science and theory, making a case as to why interventions rooted in this approach in some ways are uniquely suited to address burnout. You'll see, for instance, how in contrast with other stress management approaches, compassion-based interventions can often be worked into the reality of your workday, often specifically during moments of challenge. We're going to look at some of the mechanisms of change embedded within this approach, including mindfulness and self-compassion. Self-compassion is of particular relevance to those of us in healthcare. We are very interested in increasing the awareness of the tone and texture of that inner dialogue a clinician might hold, recognizing that this can be a source of resilience and it can be a source of added stress in a work environment that is already demanding. Along the way, and especially towards the end, we will practice some techniques together, evidence-based techniques. Keep in mind, though, full transparency, that to get the full benefit of this approach, really we're talking about an 8-week structured curriculum. But think of this as an introduction. So a little context and a definition to get things going. The World Health Organization recognizes burnout as an occupational phenomenon. Think of it as a multidimensional syndrome stemming from a combination of factors, including overwork and exhaustion, but also a somewhat cynical mindset that is an understandable reaction to feeling overwhelmed, undersupported, underappreciated, and perhaps not completely satisfied. For the clinician who remains unaware or determined to soldier through emerging symptoms of burnout, we could begin to see a callousness towards others begin to develop, a tendency to depersonalize people around you, maybe even a need to suppress emotion by building defensive walls, a numbing and avoiding of contact. Think about how this could easily morph into isolation and loneliness. Christina Maslach, a social psychologist at Stanford, noted these 3 dimensions for burnout, and she developed the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which continues to be the most widely used instrument to assess prevalence. Consider going on Google, finding a link. I think we're going to post a link to the inventory, and just as an exercise in mindfulness, seeing where you fall on these dimensions of burnout on the inventory. We have a lot more nuanced and detailed information, especially longitudinal information for burnout rates among nurses and physicians, not so much for those of us in mental health. What we do have, prevalence information, comes mostly from countries that have nationalized healthcare systems. We do have one point of data that comes from the American Psychological Association. They put out a national survey back in 2020, and so that's where we have a little bit more information for those of us in mental health. This really mirrors what you responded. The number 1 symptom of concern is emotional exhaustion. And so consider for a moment if you can relate to this, feeling emotionally drained at work, like you have nothing left to give, alternating between feeling either numb or at the other extreme, completely overwhelmed by intense feelings. These could be symptoms of emotional exhaustion. As Jackie mentioned, please feel free to use the chat feature to kind of share your reflections along the way, especially if you find yourself relating to or maybe not completely agreeing with something. All feedback is helpful. Researchers are beginning to identify both internal as well as job-related external factors that are protective against burnout or tip us in the direction of burnout. So this is what we know so far. 80% of the drivers of burnout tend to be systemic, organizational. And this again mirrors the feedback you shared with us. So work overload, the amount of documentation required, a lack of administrative support, staff shortages. Age appears to protect against burnout, with less experienced, younger mental health professionals reporting higher levels of emotional exhaustion. And of course, this could also be indicative of people who are more prone to burnout, perhaps leaving the profession earlier. Perceived support as well as opportunities for self-reflection are helpful. And so an opportunity such as this is really beneficial. And I'm so glad you've made the time. I know your schedules are very busy. Certain individual factors also can be tipping us in that direction of risk. So the tendency for perfectionism. So many years ago, the psychologist Albert Ellis noted, therapists can share certain irrational beliefs. For instance, this idea, I have to be successful with all of my clients all of the time, can add to already present pressure. Having difficulty maintaining emotional balance while engaging with patients, colleagues, as well as a heightened sensitivity to negative events. Turning next to a meta-analytic review of studies looking at the efficacy of various interventions, both individual focused as well as more systemic organizational changes targeting burnout, suggests that these work. Even though 80% of the drivers of burnout are systemic, both systemic and individual focused interventions are equally helpful in addressing burnout. Helpful in terms of how they lower burnout scores, lowered scores that are meaningful in terms of how they correlate with drops in adverse outcomes such as physician suicide. So these programs are helpful. The individual focused programs tend to be offered in silos. So you have your workday here, and then you're expected to go home and practice how to relax, adding another to-do item on a list that's already jam-packed. So in this sense, be on the lookout for how compassion techniques can be incorporated into the reality of your day, often practiced at points of contact with others. No one intervention is better than any other. And what people respond to best is being offered a menu of options from which they can pick and choose based on personal preference. And then finally, quickly, the interventions fall into 4 broad buckets: self-care, elicitation of the relaxation response, mindfulness-based stress reduction, online, self-paced psychoed modules. Even these are helpful in reducing burnout scores. And then finally, the focus of our work today, compassion-based approaches. The foundation practice within this approach is a meditation technique that, based on research by Richie Davidson, cultivates balanced brain activation in response to suffering. In contrast with relaxing imagery, a vivid by the beach scene, for instance, this is important. With compassion approaches, you will be asked to contemplate on suffering. You might, for instance, be asked to imagine yourself in a difficult situation while we give you the skills to not look away, to avoid the temptation to look away, cultivating physiological and emotional steadfastness and balance. So there's a particular neural fingerprint to this approach, a way this approach maps out in the brain that makes it very compelling as we begin to think about our needs, those of us in mental health. Our jobs require us to meet and stay with suffering. I'd like to draw on an experiential felt sense of compassion, and specifically compassion in contrast with burnout, to better illustrate related concepts. So let's begin with burnout. See if you can think of a personally meaningful example, a situation that speaks to your experience with burnout. Be reminded of this example. And then as you bring this memory to mind, how do you feel? What do you notice in your body, your mood, your thoughts. If you're comfortable, certainly feel free to share using the chat feature. It's an exercise in validation for the group.
So Vernali, we're seeing folks chat in things like anxiety, physical exhaustion, resentment, lower productivity, upset, hopelessness, again, exhaustion, guilt, panic, and a desire to escape. Also some physical sensations like a tight chest or headaches, stomach issues, and then feelings, worthlessness, numbness, cynical thinking, fatigue.
Exactly. And, you're not alone. You can see even in this group, there is so much validation for this experience with burnout. Now, just to contrast this, I'm going to change gears a little bit and see if you can bring to mind a personally meaningful example of compassion. Maybe you were on the receiving end of care, or maybe you provided a helping hand. Maybe you simply witnessed an act of kindness between two strangers. So take a moment to see if you can be reminded of an example of compassion. And then similarly, connect with what might be going on in your body, your thoughts, and your mood. As you look at the difference, I want to turn next to offer you a conceptual framework, understanding how compassion unfolds and why interventions rooted in this approach are so suited to address burnout. So compassion is innate. It's a natural capacity for caring, an instinctive response to witnessing suffering, but it does compete with other drives and instincts, such as our vigilance to threat system or the tendency for self-preservation. We are learning, though, that we can actually train for compassion so that we are better able to override competing instincts when exposed to suffering. And we're learning that turning to compassion rather than empathy, for instance, is healthier for us. Researchers at Emory evaluated the effects of a compassion training program and found lower levels of stress hormones in the blood and saliva of people who spent the most time doing the compassion exercises. Think of compassion not so much as a discrete emotion you might have more or less of, but rather a complex interaction of cognitive, physiological, emotional, motivational components that unfolds in stages in response to witnessing suffering. Each stage informs and mutually reinforces the next. Let's just walk through the process. It begins with awareness. After all, if you aren't even aware of suffering, someone else's or your own, you can't respond to it. So in this way, compassion hinges on mindfulness. From that place of awareness, there may follow identification, a connection with the person who is suffering, with their pain. On the basis of that connection, there could be a desire to relieve their suffering based off of a series of cognitive appraisals and quick decision points. Is this person important to me? Does this person deserve my attention? Do I have the resources to provide care? There needs to be a hope or a belief that you can, in fact, make a difference in order to be willing to take a helping action and for the entire compassion cycle to flow. Not always, but there could be a sense of satisfaction of having made a difference that actually you might sense in your body as a warm glow. There are physiological shifts that come with the experience of compassion satisfaction, such as an increase in oxytocin, feel-good hormone, an increase in positive emotions. It is the hallmark of sustainable compassion because it is rejuvenating. The fact that compassion unfolds in stages allows us to train for specific skills that will allow for the process to unfold with ease. The fact that compassion unfolds in stages makes it vulnerable to falling apart. There could be blockages along the way, but we can train for that as well. For instance, what if you empathize with the other, but in doing so, take on their feelings so completely, it causes you overwhelm? It might be difficult to proceed to the stage of taking helping action. You might get stuck at empathy and experience empathic distress. What if you empathize, feel connected, you're able to balance your emotion, but in thinking about taking a helping action, just the scope of the problem seems so big, you doubt your ability to be efficacious. It might be harder to proceed to compassion. Compassion training takes into account all of this and methodically puts into place evidence-based interventions and skills training. So just take a moment to note how the unfolding stages of compassion contrast with the symptoms of burnout you are noticing. And so in this way, something you carry within, an instinct, a very natural instinct that is well trained for those of us in mental health, you can refine and further develop, making it a resource that is powerful in the face of burnout. Emotional exhaustion is highlighted, and it's important because it's the most frequently reported symptom of concern reported by those of us in mental health. Understanding the neurophysiology and the difference between empathy and compassion is very important in thinking about how we might manage empathic distress. And so this is a model developed by the psychologist Dr. Tanya Singer, based off of a series of fMRI images of the brain in a study where she trained people on empathy or compassion or a control group. And what she found is that whether you are coming from a place of primarily empathetic identification or compassion, you are equally able to engage in helping altruistic behaviors. However, the way you experience the dynamic is very different and has ultimately differential outcomes for the potential for burnout. Empathy involves mostly cognitive perspective taking. It makes it possible to resonate with the positive feelings of another, negative feelings of another, usually easier to empathize with someone you feel is more similar to you. As you resonate with positive feelings, it feels good. Negative feelings and suffering can be distressing, especially if the self and other distinction gets blurred. This can lead us towards distress, causing us to shut down. Compassion, in contrast, builds on empathy with its focus on helping and positive emotions such as hope, meaning, connection that accompany compassionate action. With compassion, we see balanced brain activation that allows for improved mood regulation. There's a distinctive physiology that goes with the experience of compassion, again, marked by activation, balance between activation and calm. So yes, there will be an initial alarm when you're exposed to suffering. How can there not be? But very quickly thereafter, what you see is a more balanced autonomic system engagement, including increased heart rate variability that is indicative of a flexibility, a nimbleness in the face of distressing situations, and improved ability to soothe yourself and regulate emotion. And it's for this reason, far from an association with burnout, with compassion as opposed to empathy, there is a link with positive health outcome and resilience. Somebody in the chat was asking for this, so I wanted to share this, a list of evidence-based compassion training programs. They are similar in many ways, but have a slightly different point of focus. So with mindfulness-based, mindful self-compassion, this is Kristen Neff's program. The focus is very much on increasing self-compassion. This is the program that probably has the most amount of empirical literature to support its use. CBCT, cognitively based compassion training, has a strong focus on mental training techniques, very similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot of research to support its use as an antidote to burnout. At Emory, where it was developed, med students and faculty, staff, it's a very popular program there. CCT, that's the program I am trained in, was developed at Stanford. And here the focus is on improving interpersonal connection, helping people feel at ease interpersonally. With all of these programs, there is a progression of skills developed that allows for the cultivation of a more sustainable version of compassion that is really focused on helping you balance the distress that comes with doing the kind of work we do. So what do I mean by sustainable compassion? I'm not going to go through all of this, but two things I'll point out. Sustainable compassion is dynamic and holistic. It includes the self. What do we mean by self-compassion? It's not just self-care. It's really much more about how you show up, how you support yourself, especially during challenging moments. So for compassion to be sustainable, it cannot only be directed at patients. We need to include ourselves in the circle of compassion. We cannot just think about one type of compassion satisfaction, the kind that may come from appreciation once we are giving the care to someone else. It may not happen that way. Yes, the warm glow and meaning can come from moments of positive connection and caring, but frequently satisfaction may not be coming from the person you are caring for. Consider for a moment if you've ever had a difficult patient or you've cared for closer to home a difficult family member. There may be limited compassion satisfaction, but we want to think about a holistic version where there are other sources where we draw the compassion satisfaction from, maybe other interactions, and we find ways to savor, especially physiologically, the benefits of that satisfaction. Focusing for a moment on self-compassion. Often in the kind of work environments we practice in, we are understandably and appropriately very focused on outcome. There is zero tolerance for mistakes. Excellence is valued. You can see how that outer landscape of healthcare may breed what you already have a vulnerability for, perfectionism. This struggle with perfectionism, Nedro points out, may show up in the form of an inner dialogue that is constantly nagging in tone, self-critical, leaving you irritable, hopeless, like nothing you do is ever good enough. Any tendency for perfectionism can easily morph into self-criticism and even shame and withdrawal in an environment that is difficult, competitive, challenging. There could be a tendency, and see if you can relate to this, to replay and ruminate multiple times on a difficult interaction, often through a self-critical filter, leaving us embarrassed or wanting to withdraw, avoid. And unfortunately, we don't similarly replay positive interactions in a way that leaves us feeling whole and better. So it's not just the objective situation that causes us stress, right? It's how we talk about ourselves, how we talk to ourselves as we navigate that inherently difficult situation that could multiply the tension. Psychologically, then, we're taking these perceived shortcomings, mistakes, not being able to achieve the outcome we want, taking it in, and it's contributing to burnout by encouraging a range of physiological sympathetic nervous system reactivities that correspond to fight, flight, or freeze. How we talk to ourselves is adding to the stress. Kristen Neff, a leading researcher in the field of self-compassion, has operationalized self-compassion as having three interwoven dimensions: mindfulness, common humanity, that sense of self as being part of a whole, and self-kindness. And used in conjunction, training for these three dimensions, we can work on reactivating and strengthening self-compassion. So we are next going to practice some techniques together. I hope that sharing a little bit of this foundation will make now more sense as we segue into the experiential piece. Please be curious. If you can, have a piece of paper and something to write with handy so you can jot down your reflections, any questions, observations that come up in preparation for the dialogue. A few points before we practice. We are trying to change the way the brain responds to the kind of difficult work environments that we are a part of. The brain is neuroplastic. We know that through practice, we can make these changes, but it requires practice. Not all of the techniques you might be willing to try will feel automatically relaxing and comfortable. This is by design. We are training for compassion, which by definition is a response to suffering. If at any point a technique feels too uncomfortable for you, please let go of the instructions and just focus on your breath. And at the same time, be curious about adopting a growth mindset. So stretching yourself a little bit, but not to the point of overwhelm. And then be reminded of the initial compassion diagram. So this is a very customizable approach, and we encourage you to trust your own inner wisdom. Be curious about which aspect of compassion for you might benefit from shoring up, what particular obstacle could be problematic, maybe with a particular colleague or a patient, a situation. And so really take this information, but think about how it applies to you and your situation, and therefore which technique might make sense for you to practice. And then finally, this diagram here summarizes what we are trying to achieve really with each practice. There will be an initial alarm in response to suffering, but what we are trying to achieve is balanced activation in response to the suffering through emotion regulation. We want to find a way for you to remain present, engaged, without either veering into distress or building up defensive walls. So really, it's about emotion regulation. The foundation approach is a series of guided meditations that builds on the twin pillars of mindfulness and compassion. We start in week 1 with a very simple guided mindfulness-based meditation, and we'll practice together a small sample in a few minutes. And then over the course of the 8 weeks, most of these programs are offered in the context of an 8-week curriculum. Over the course of the 8 weeks, we build on a different building block of compassion using CBT type mental orienting techniques. We're trying to change the way we think in response to suffering. We are trying to instill a mindset of loving kindness. Some of you might have heard of the term, really coming from a place of caring. And so every week we're looking at a different meditation technique. It culminates in week 8 with a technique that is focused on building courage, fearlessness, and resilience. Attributes that are really necessary and required in the kind of work environments we are practicing in. So if you're ready now, let's take a moment to meditate together. Maybe put your stuff to the side. Close your eyes if you're comfortable, but you don't have to. You can just lower your gaze. Make any adjustments you need to get into a comfortable seated position, a position that you can hold in relative stillness for a couple of minutes. Let your breath just fall into its natural rate and rhythm, breathing in and out through your nose. And then take a moment for self-observation. How am I feeling? Notice your breath. No need to change anything. Simply rest your attention at your breath as you breathe in and out. Let's spend a couple of seconds in silence as you keep your attention at your breath. You may notice your mind wandering. That's what the mind likes to do. In an attempt to build focus, see if you can bring your attention back to your breath. And every time you breathe out, silently repeat the number 1 to yourself. Breathing in, you breathe in. Breathing out, you do so while silently reciting the number 1. This could help anchor your attention to your breath. And so just another few moments of silence as you follow your breath in this manner. Now let go of the counting. Take a deep breath and just rest for a moment. Check in with yourself one more time. How am I feeling? So that was a very shortened and simple mindfulness-based meditation. The recommendation would be to try to practice 10 to 15 minutes a day. Each of the programs I shared with you have associated with meditations, guided meditations that you are introduced to on a weekly basis. And keep in mind, what we're trying to do through the mental training is to really give you access to compassion as the instinct you will turn to most readily when exposed to suffering. Why? Because it is protective against burnout. With the mindfulness piece, we are trying to build awareness by settling the mind, allowing you to think a little clearer, and it gives you access to another emotion regulation tool. Now, 10 to 15 minutes may not be something that many of us can commit to. What I would say is even a 1-minute practice, so long as it is practiced on a daily basis, can be very helpful and extremely powerful. For those of you who are not able to or not so interested in the meditation practice, know that you can derive the benefits of mindfulness through what we call a mindful pause, incorporating this into the reality of your workday. So think about checking in with yourself as we did with the meditation, self-observation. How am I feeling? What is going on with my breath? What's happening in my body? How am I feeling? A few times a day. You don't need to change anything. Just that act of observation is a way to build that capacity for awareness, an important part of compassion. So a few times during the day. Another thing you can think about during moments of transition, taking a deeper than normal breath. This might be in between patients. It might be before a meeting, at the end of a meeting, a deeper than normal breath. Again, a way to bring a mindful pause very intentionally into the reality of your workday, incorporating opportunities for emotion regulation. Another thing to consider, grounding imagery, especially in anticipation of a difficult interpersonal interaction, perhaps during the interaction. This could look as simple as my feet on the ground. How do my feet on the ground feel? How do my hands in my lap feel? Chair against my back. So noticing those points of contact as a way to ground you and create an embodied self of boundaries. And so this can be a very helpful reminder to shift away from empathic distress more towards care through the creation of healthier boundaries. We're going to move next onto a self-compassion technique. And for this, again, a reminder, it would be helpful if you had a piece of paper and something to write with in front of you. All right, I hope you're ready. Get into a comfortable seated position again. Close your eyes if you're comfortable, or if not, lower your gaze. And just breathe naturally for a few moments. Bring to mind a friend who you know is going through a difficult time. Perhaps they're experiencing an upsetting situation which involves some kind of rejection, disappointment, maybe even perceived failure, and imagine that your friend is really being hard on themselves. Take a moment to reconnect with an actual memory that speaks to this experience, or see if you can imagine something similar. As you hold this memory in mind, what are you thinking? How do you feel? Do you notice any shifts within your body? Do you notice any behavioral urges? Take a deep breath. Now, write down 2 phrases of support you could use to soothe and encourage your friend. Authentic words that come from your heart. 2 phrases of support you could use to soothe and encourage your friend. And now turn the page over so that it doesn't distract you during the next part of this exercise. Take a deep breath. Now see if you can bring to mind a time when you yourself perhaps acted in a way that you feel regretful about. Maybe you used an unkind word. Perhaps you were impatient with a colleague. See if you can remember some of the context so you can better connect with some of your related thoughts and feelings. So stay with this memory. Take a moment to greet and collect your thoughts. How do you feel in your body? What is the tone and texture of the self-talk, that inner dialogue? Now turn the page back over and silently read back to yourself the phrases of support you had previously generated for a friend. Take a deep breath. And sit in silence for a moment, allowing the experience to sink in, reflect, and note down some initial reactions. So the point of the phrases, they were generated by you. So the capacity to care exists within. And the idea is, can you find a way to access them when it's you that needs the soothing? This then becomes a very potent way for you to soothe and calm yourself, a very effective tool in emotion regulation, especially during difficult interpersonal interactions. Sorry. All right, and the moment of nurture, I'll just quickly go through this before we segue into Q&A. So this is based off of work by Dr. Paul Gilbert. He is the founder of Compassion Focused Therapy. And based on his research, he suggests that access to self-soothing inside is much easier to reach if we bypass the cognitive and sort of focus more on visualization. And based on his research, visualizing an image that brings us a sense of nurturance or care is associated with an increase in heart rate variability, an increase in oxytocin, lighting up of the nurturing affiliative regions of the brain. So it's another way to emotion regulate. Spend some time thinking about an image that for you brings you that sense of comfort. It could be a pet, it could be a place in nature, it could be a favorite worn out armchair, it could be a grandparent, just someone, a place, a person, a thing that for you just inspires a strong sense of acceptance and feeling nurtured. And the idea would be to practice conjuring up this image and then to access it during moments of difficulty as a way to soothe. So this is a moment of nurture. And then we already talked about savoring moments of connection, really being open to witnessing, appreciating other sources of satisfaction, even if it isn't readily available from the immediate interaction. And then micro moments of connection. This is based off of research by Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, in which she notes that little moments of connection, even between strangers, have a very powerful impact on your physiology. You see it in changes in your heart rate, for instance. That little moment of connection can be extremely healing in terms of physiology. And that micro moment of connection, again, is something that we can help to fuel the compassion engine. So this is just a few different techniques I wanted to introduce you to, and then I want to share some resources and then open it up for questions. All right, so for those of you interested in a full 8-week training course, CBCT at Emory, Mindful Self-Compassion, I will be offering a training course, most likely through NYU Silver. It'll be maybe even an in-person course in January, in the spring. For those of you who are leaders in healthcare attending this hour, and maybe you're interested in bringing something onto your units, the Center for Compassionate Leadership offers a certificate in bringing compassion to organizations. And then for those of you who might be interested in teacher training, learning how to teach these techniques, the Compassion Education Alliance offers a teacher training. I believe it's scheduled to start in the fall. I am ready for questions.
Renali, thank you so much. What an amazing presentation. And we've had a great audience. They've been interacting a lot and they have lots of questions. One that sort of kept coming up that I feel like folks are dealing with is how you can avoid burnout when you're dealing with an unsupportive or toxic work environment. Maybe that's unsupportive supervisors or toxic coworkers, or just a toxic work environment generally.
It's hard to answer without knowing the specifics, but I'll try to answer in generality. And I guess the first thing I would point out is the research would suggest that even though a driver of burnout is environmental, still the individual focused interventions, in other words, practicing the techniques for yourself, could be very helpful. What I would invite you to do is to go back to this diagram of unfolding compassion and to think about how you might be able to map out the toxicity in your work environment using this diagram. So this is very much not a sort of like, I give you techniques, I'm some kind of expert in your practice. Really, you are the expert. And I encourage you to think really deeply about where the problem might be. So for instance, is it a particularly difficult person? Is that sort of one way to think about what is kind of driving you towards burnout? And if it is a very difficult person, in this approach, there are, for instance, meditations we practice where we work on holding a difficult person to mind, acknowledging the pain, the difficulty, the suffering this person might be causing. And then as an exercise in self-compassion, not an exercise in forgiveness or acceptance, but in self-compassion, learning how to better manage the physiological, emotional changes that come that are so uncomfortable in dealing with this difficult person, who in some places may even have supervisory or other kinds of implications on the kind of work environment we have.
Fantastic. I know you mentioned that there are specific training programs for supervisors and organizations that want to bring this to the organizations. And we were wondering also, when you talked about that self-compassion and the antidote sort of to perfection, I'm wondering if you have any general suggestions for supervisors and how they can support their staff's capacity for self-compassion while still maintaining like a sense of accountability.
Yes. And this is where Nedros, she asked people to reflect on the question, how can I still be focused on excellence and doing my best, but have self-compassion for the moments when I can't or when there's a mistake. And what's really important here, and this is where some of the systemic changes become helpful, are there opportunities for growth? We talk about in this approach the importance of the growth mindset. So it isn't about staying at the safety of home base, not ever changing, not looking for ways we could be better. It's not getting to the point of complete overwhelm and falling apart, but being able to stretch a little bit. So are there opportunities to look at mistakes in a way that encourages growth rather than a shutting down and a becoming defensive? So that might be
things as a learning moment as opposed to something to punish yourself for, or to feel like is a loss, but rather it's a gain in some ways. Fantastic.
I do want to say that a lot of this, I don't at all mean to communicate, oh, this is so easy, just try this technique and everything's going to be fine. Far from that, far from that. This is a practice. It's a way of thinking. But I will say that I'll share the research supports that this helps in reducing burnout. But just personally, I practiced in an environment where there was one particular team meeting. I still don't quite understand that team meeting, but we would leave that team meeting and there'd be people in all kinds of state of upset. Through practicing these techniques, I remember looking back at those meetings, able to see even a little bit of sense of humor and like we're all in this together, despite the hostility that was just unleashed in the meeting.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can probably relate to that. And also what you're speaking to is those moments of connection as well with the colleagues, right? At least you're in this together. Some folks have also been asking for any book recommendations you have for further reading.
Yes. Compassionomics is a really good book. It's looking at bringing compassion to medicine. And I can share information, Jackie, with you. Maybe you can post it.
Yes.
Anything by Kristen Neff is helpful. Her website has a ton of information and resources. And then for people who, and I probably should have mentioned this at some point during the talk, all of this is evidence-based, but it is rooted in Buddhist philosophy, which is uniquely interested in understanding the nature of suffering and offers compassion as an antidote. So if you look at Buddhist philosophy, any writing by Pema Chodron is extremely accessible, clear, concise, and extremely powerful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I think you've maybe already touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering for those folks who are maybe feeling still a little hesitant, or who maybe for all of this self-compassion just doesn't feel natural. It can feel sort of like, maybe people are a little more cynical about it, or it feels, too touchy-feely for people. What do you suggest to those folks who maybe are having some trouble buying in?
Yeah, absolutely. The recommendation is, at a very practical level, maybe this doesn't have to be the way for you, right? So what the research says is there are these 4 different approaches. Pick and choose which one feels right for you. PsychoEd online self-paced modules are equally helpful. There isn't one approach that's any better. The important thing is to recognize that there may be symptoms of burnout and to understand that there are all these different strategies that can be helpful for you. So if this doesn't feel right, trust your wisdom. This doesn't have to be for you. At the same time, if something doesn't feel right, there could be a resistance. It is very common to see resistance, especially towards self-compassion. Common resistances might be something like, oh, if I start to think about self-compassion, I might overindulge and I'm just not going to achieve any of my goals. Another resistance to self-compassion might have to do with deserving self-compassion or being vulnerable to accept help from others. These are very common resistances. With a talk like this, what is important to note is the program tends to be 8 weeks. And so there are opportunities to explore all of these complicated factors, which your audience is, very quickly already picking up on. So if there is an interest, I do encourage you to explore the possibility of looking at one of these longer programs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basu, and thank you so much, everyone, for your for attending. We're going to be posting these slides to the CTAC website, so please keep an eye out for those. We'll also be posting some of the resources that Dr. Basu mentioned, and also please check out the CTAC website for our upcoming events. We have some trainings coming up on best practices in youth peer advocacy, and an upcoming webinar on supporting caregivers of youth with autism spectrum disorder coming up on the 29th. Thank you all so much for attending, and I hope everyone has a great day.